All right, so this is lesson 2 of the reliability of the scriptures, again based on historical Christian evidences by the Sunset International Bible Institute. We start out with a review, like usual. We talked last week about the objective nature of Christianity, and we talked about the problems with depending on our feelings, right? The fact that Christianity is based on real facts, real things that happened in life, in history, events that were documented, and there are certain teachings, there were certain things that were said and done, and we have to analyze those things and see, what's the basis for believing this? Is it in reality, or is it not? Right? It's not enough just to say, well, it sounds good to me, it feels good to me. That can lead to a lot of different problems and believing just about anything, because lots of things sound good to lots of people, right? And so if we're going to base it on feeling or subjectivity, then Christianity is just as true and right as Islam or atheism or whatever else you want, right? It's all just based on how you feel at the time. But Christianity is really based in fact, in truth, and in reliable history, in the historical events that are recorded in the Bible. So we want to go back and analyze those things and see what we can get from that, right? We looked last week also at the non-biblical writers, right? We looked at the fact that they established the existence of Jesus at that time, right? They proved that Jesus... They proved Jesus' deity and his resurrection were not just later inventions, but that they were there in the very beginning. Pliny's letter we saw, he's talking about the people there singing and a hymn to Jesus as a God just at the very beginning of the 2nd century. So that means this is not something from later on in the time of Constantine or something where a lot of people try to put things in, or some later invention of the Catholic Church. Now, things were added and changed as time went by. I'm not going to deny that, but the essential core of Christianity and the things that we have in the New Testament are reliable 1st century facts, right? They're not later inventions. So when we talk about the historical reliability of the New Testament, we need to think about a few things, right? First is that we have a very limited knowledge of Jesus from the non-Christian sources, right? We talked about those last week, the Gentile sources and Jewish sources. We don't have a lot of information, right? We don't, we know that he taught something and that he performed some signs, right? But we don't have any specifics about that. The Jewish sources kind of equated with magic and demonic powers, but they don't really go into a lot of detail like we see in the New Testament. We know that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate in Judea, right, in Jerusalem. Those are facts that we see in the historical record outside the Bible. We also have some evidence of his resurrection, right? Not all of the sources talk about that, but some of them do. That Jesus was still alive, that he had been raised from the dead. And so, whether or not you believe that the evidence is there for the resurrection, there is a historical claim that took place, right? So we want to analyze the evidence, which we'll do as we go through this course. Also, that he was worshipped as God, right? We saw that in the letter of Pliny I mentioned just a moment ago. So these are some basic facts about Jesus, right? But if we don't have the New Testament, right, then we don't know anything about Jesus' teaching, right? We know nothing about his life. We know nothing about his burial. We know nothing about the evidence for the resurrection, right? We know that there was a belief, but why, right? What was the evidence being given at that time, right? The non-biblical sources don't have that, but the New Testament has that in abundance. So when we talk on the New Testament and our faith, right, we have to realize that our faith really comes from the New Testament. And we mentioned, I think at the end of the last lesson, about how some people will say, "Oh, I believe in that Jesus was a good guy," or "I believe that Jesus was this or that." They might put too much emphasis. Well, sorry, they don't put too much emphasis, but they believe some things that are only found in the New Testament, right? They don't believe all these things in the New Testament, but they somehow believe that Jesus was a good teacher, or that Jesus was a good man, right? And so what they're telling us there is that the New Testament documents are reliable documents to tell us how good of a man Jesus was, or some of the good things he taught, but they're not reliable enough for actually believing what Jesus said. So it's this weird kind of situation where they're depending on the documents for their interpretation of Jesus, but they're rejecting the conclusion of those documents, right? But our faith comes from the New Testament. It comes from the testimony of the apostles, right? And we'll get more into the testimony of the apostles as we go along, but we see that in Jesus' prayer in John chapter 17, verse 20. Jesus says, "Not only for these do I pray," talking about the 12 disciples, or 11 at that point, that are with him. He says, "but for those also who will believe in me through their word," right? So that's us, right? That's everyone since then that heard the message of the apostles and believed it. So when we ask what's the ground for our faith in Jesus, well, it's not pagan sources, right? It's not Jewish sources. Those give us a little information, and it's a nice historical reference, but it's also certainly not any kind of existential experience or subjective feeling. Now we might have something like that, right? We're obviously going to have some feeling about Jesus. Many people have had some sort of religious experience, right? They've had some sort of spiritual thing. Maybe they had some kind of vision, or some kind of great feeling of relief or something when they were forgiven, or when their life changed, right? But that in and of itself, as wonderful as it is still subjective, right? Again, people have that kind of feeling for all different reasons, right? They go and become a Zen Buddhist and try to become one with the universe or something, and they feel so much better because they're not angry all the time, or something like that. They've changed certain habits in their life, but that doesn't prove that that's the right way to live, right? It proves that there are some good things about that, but it's not established in fact, in the truth, right? Our faith really is grounded in the testimony of the apostles, right? Just like Paul says in Romans 10:17, our faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God, right? God has said something, it's been passed on through these messengers, and when we hear that and we believe it, we trust in that. That's what faith really means, is trusting in God. We trust that message and that it's been passed down to us. And one of the reasons that we trust that message is because of the fact that we can verify some of it, right? We can verify lots of little elements surrounding the message. And archaeology helps us to do that, right? Modern archaeology began in about 1789, right? If you go back to the time of Napoleon, right? He was the emperor of France, and he sent an expedition to Egypt. They wanted to, kind of conquer the world, but in that military expedition, there was also a scientific expedition that went, and they brought back all these antiquities from the Nile Valley, and they did all this documenting and research and things like that. And this is where archaeology first got started. They're looking back at the history of these things. What are these scripts? What is this writing? What are these monuments say? What can we learn about that, right? And so since that time, it's been over 200 years, right, that people have been going from place to place. They've been digging up ancient artifacts. They've been doing research. They've been reflecting on, the Bible says this or the Bible says that. Can we find this place? Can we find evidence of this culture or practice? And so there's a lot of evidence that has been building and building and building over the years, right? And there are a lot of theories that come out. Sometimes that, these people in the Bible, they're never mentioned, they didn't exist. And then 50 years later, somebody finds, a great whole library of tablets written by these people or something. And so we find out there was a whole civilization that had been lost to history for, 3,000 years that was only discovered because people were trying to go back and verify some of these things in the Bible and verify things in history. They were interested in the past and looking into this. And so, despite efforts to the contrary, the biblical record has been confirmed again and again and again. There are obviously some points of disagreement. Various archaeologists have different interpretations of the evidence. And so some of them might look and see these layers and classify them one way, while another group classifies them a different way. But there seems to be always a way to match it, to interpret it with the Bible. And we'll go through the reliability of the Old Testament later on, but we'll look at some of these competing theories and some of these how well the Bible lines up in lists of kings and timelines and all of that stuff. It's remarkably accurate when it comes to those things, unlike a lot of other documents like that. Now, when we look at the New Testament, though, specifically, we can look at a guy named Sir William Ramsay, right? He was living in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was originally a New Testament skeptic. It was a common period at that time where people didn't believe the Bible very much. They were skeptical. The book of Acts was supposedly the least reliable book in the New Testament. Everyone thought it was a fiction. And I say everyone, obviously not everyone. There were a lot of people that believed it very much, a lot of people in the church. But as far as scholars in a university in Germany or something, and these guys looking back into archaeology, they said, "Oh no, this is not good. This guy," they had a theory that it was written hundreds of years later, and it was just inserting these different things about a different time. But when Sir William Ramsay started his career studying Asia Minor, right, going around the area of Galatia and Asia and traveling all around Greece and all of that area, he became quite an expert on it, and he kept running into the fact that Acts, far from being destroyed by his findings, was being confirmed over and over again. And so he eventually wrote in his book, The Bearing of Recent Discovery, says, further study showed that the book could bear the most minute scrutiny as an authority for the facts of the Aegean world, and that it was written with such judgment, skill, art, and perception of truth as to be a model of historical statement. Right? So this is a guy that, in the beginning of his time there in Asia Minor, he didn't believe the book of Acts was legitimate. But, after a few decades, he realized it was about the best document that they have about that period of the world. I mean, obviously, it's not going to tell us about every single thing, but in every way that you can confirm the book of Acts, it's there, right? In the most minute detail, from the region boundaries and the titles of the different officials in different places. It matches the world of that time in the first century when it was written. It's not a century later or 2 centuries after that. It really is specifically to that time period of the first century when it claims to have been written. Ramsay also wrote a couple of pages later, "You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians." Right? He's very accurate, very precise, and you can just trust what he says. Right? It's quite remarkable. Some people don't look at the book of Acts as a book of history or the book of Luke, but it is. It really is. And that's what he meant it to be. And for the record, Ramsay, if you want, he's got quite a few books like St. Paul the Traveler and the Cities of St. Paul. You can find some of those on archive.org or maybe a ebook somewhere. And there's a lot of kind of valuable insights on the cities and background of the New Testament. And you can really learn a whole lot more about just the world of that time in general. It's pretty interesting reading. But back to the New Testament, if we think about the time of the New Testament, when the writers were writing it, right? There were other people writing at the same time, right? We've got guys like Tacitus and Josephus writing their histories. Now, actually, Tacitus is going to be a bit later, right? Josephus also. Most of the New Testament was written a little before them, but they're writing about the same period in history, right? These guys are historians of the New Testament era, and beyond. But we've got these things, and so when these guys like Tacitus and Josephus are writing their histories, or when the writers of the New Testament are writing them, they put them into this certain historical context, right? They're explaining the time in that time, right? They're talking about what's going on. They're referencing, maybe not referencing each other, but they're referencing the same characters and the same people, right? And so the question is, right, if someone's going to accept a classical historian, right, like Tacitus or Josephus, and they say, well, these guys are reliable about what they're talking about. But the New Testament, we see it's speaking about the same people and the same kind of events, and they're confirming each other and complementing each other. Then shouldn't we accept that the New Testament is reliable as well, right? Because these are first-hand documents, right? These are sometimes eyewitness testimony of what's going on, or actual letters being sent back and forth to people and groups of churches and things. We're getting real events that are going on at that time. And so we can consider some historical checkpoints, right? When we look through the books of the Bible and we look through these other histories, we can think of some points to compare. One is certain persons, right? We are going to go through a list of those from Luke in just a little bit, but like Caesar or which Caesar? There's a bunch of Caesars, right? Or Pontius Pilate or Herod, right? Those are historical checkpoints, right? There's certain events, right? There might have been a famine or an earthquake or the darkness that we talked about, when Jesus was crucified. There's lots of different events. People might get kicked out of a place, or there might be a census or something like that. Can we find those mentioned in both in the New Testament and in the secular history, right? Certain times, right? The reign of this person or that person, this year of that. Elapsed time between one event and another, right? Those are important. Certain places, right? These we can see this is happening in Jerusalem, this is happening in Ephesus, this is happening in Rome, right? Do the accounts match up, right? These guys are all talking about many of them talk about the morals of the time, right? What are the standards that the people have? How are they living, right? We see how the church is acting, how they're treating each other. Some of the sins that are mentioned there, and Paul says, you used to be like this, right? Some of the cult practices, if we go back to things like in the Old Testament, right? We see the traditions of concubinage and slavery and all those kinds of things going on, right? How do those compare with what we see outside of the Bible, right? These historians and writers write about the linguistics of the time, or they wrote in the linguistics of the time, right? So you can kind of compare. Is this writing sound like it's from that time period, right? Or is it from a later age, right? We can tell because words get used differently as time goes on, right? Statements get spelling, all sorts of different things like that change over time. Just like you can tell the difference between someone that's writing in 2010 versus 1910, right? It's a very different style of writing, and so we can date these kinds of things by the style that they're written in. Also, things like politics, climate, customs, culture, all of these things are stirred around in all these books, and as we look at them and we see, do they match up, right? That's what we're basically talking about. So if we go over to the book of Mark, all right, I'm sorry, not Mark, book of Luke, he introduces the ministry of John the Baptist in Luke chapter 3, verses 1 to 2, right? Now, this is just 2 verses of the Gospel of Luke, right? And in introducing the ministry of John the Baptist, he mentions all of these people, right? He mentions the time of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, Herod the Tetrarch of Galilee, Philip, the tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene, Annas, Caiaphas, both high priests, and John the Baptist. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different people mentioned in 2 verses, right? That's a lot of names. Luke has narrowed down very specifically the time that Jesus came on the scene, right? When John the Baptist was having his ministry, that's when Jesus came in, and that's what Luke is presenting here, right? So we know very specifically within just a couple of years, right, when this happens, because the Caesar will change, Pilate's time there will change, the high priest will change out, these other guys, right? So we can kind of match all these things up and say, wow, we know right when this happened, right? Not to mention the fact that our whole calendar is kind of based on this, so we've got it within a few years anyway. But it's a very important event, right? And the fact that all of these guys can be found mentioned outside of the Bible, right, in other classical stories, or in the case of Lysanias, there's some possible references to him in Josephus, but we also have inscriptions, right, from the city of Abila that mention him as a tetrarch, right? And so, wow, it's all these things are there. Now, again, that's something that was only recently discovered, maybe in the last few decades, I think. But, people previously thought, oh, who's this guy? He's not actually mentioned here. Luke doesn't know what he's talking about. He just invented someone from a later time, or he took someone from an earlier time, actually, because there was a Lysanias that existed about 40 years before that. But it's there, right? Luke has it right every time that we can check him. It's pretty amazing. So we look at the Gospels in specifically. We can compare them to some of these historical things, right? So we got the darkness in Mark 15:33, right, in the crucifixion of Jesus. We mentioned that before, and we talked about Thallus, the pagan historian, that he tries to explain that same darkness as an eclipse. Now, another historian is commenting on his work and saying, well, that can't be because the Passover happens during the full moon. There's no eclipse during the full moon. We talked about that. But these historians are addressing things that are brought up in the New Testament, right? They're trying to reconcile what's going on with their own experience, right? And so they give some testimony that those events actually took place. Now we have Acts chapter 11, verse 27 to 28, right? There's a famine prophesied by Agabus, and it mentions that famine came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar, right? Now Luke wrote that probably around 60 AD or so. Now Josephus writes a bit later than that. He's going to be writing after 70 AD, maybe around 75, 80. Can't remember when he did his work exactly. But he makes an observation that famine, right, in the time of Claudius, it did come to pass, and that was about the year 45 AD, right? So here we have, again, 2 independent accounts of the same event, one in the New Testament, one in a secular historian, and they both match up, right? Then we've got Sergius Paulus, right? He's the proconsul of the island of Cyprus. Saul and Barnabas rather, go and meet him in Acts chapter 13. He's there with Elymas the sorcerer, you remember? And people have looked back for this guy, and it turns out there's an inscription on the island of Cyprus that mentions some things. It was made in about the year 54 AD, but it mentions a previous event, right, that happened during the time of the proconsul Paulus, right? Now, Paulus is kind of a family name of sorts, right? There's a lot of Pauluses, or Pauli as they would be in Latin, this is just the perfect timing, right? That this could be this guy, right? We don't know quite how long he was there. We can't be 100% sure, but again, it matches up very well with what we see, right? Then again, talking about Claudius, who was the Caesar during the book of Acts. Acts 18, 1-2 says that Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome, right, in his life of Claudius. Now, we mentioned this again last time, that Suetonius refers to the same event about 120 AD when he's writing his history. Of course, he's writing it long after the fact, about 50 or 55 years later. But they had been kicked out of Rome for that time. And so, again, confirmation between the two sources. Now, we want to turn our attention to the gospel in particular, right? Those are some interesting things from Acts. Maybe we'll talk about some other ones as we go along. But the gospel is a very interesting book, and a lot of this stuff here comes from this book. You might be able to see it. Can We Trust the Gospels? By Peter Williams. It's a very interesting book with a lot of information about the analysis. We'll go through a little bit of it today. But he talks about the writings about the Emperor Tiberius, right? We talked a minute ago, Luke said that it was the Tiberius Caesar who was in charge of the Roman Empire when Jesus came on the scene, right, during his ministry. And if we go back and we look, there are 4 writers that write about the Emperor Tiberius, right? It might be kind of small, but we have Velleius Paterculus, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, right? These are the 4 different guys that write about Jesus. And about Tiberius. And we've got 4 guys that write about Jesus, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know those. Now, there's word counts here, right? And you'll notice that Tacitus, he wrote by far the most, right? He was pretty much the most prolific historian of the Roman era there. And so he wrote a lot. But most of that 48,000 words is not about Tiberius, right? It's about the annals of the Roman Empire, about what all was going on in the Roman Empire during that time, right? And so very little is actually about Tiberius himself, right? But the first thing we need to realize about this is that 4 is a lot, right? To have 4 biographies of the same person 2,000 years ago was, wow, that's a lot, right? We have 4 biographies of the emperor. We have to remember, the emperor is the most famous, most powerful person in the world, right? And then we happen to have 4 biographies of Jesus, right? So that's quite amazing. And note that the biographies of Jesus were all written before the biographies of Tiberius. Now, there's one that was written during Tiberius' lifetime by his friend Velleius, but the other 3 were written 50 or 100, maybe even 200 years after his death. So we've got 4 contemporaries of Jesus writing about him, where there's only 1 contemporary writing about Tiberius. And then again, Cassius Dio also, who wrote quite a bit, he's not writing about Tiberius himself so much. He's writing about that time. So a lot of that word count there doesn't match up. So we can see that Jesus has more extended text about him in general, closer in proximity to his life, than his contemporary Tiberius, the most famous person in the then known world. So that speaks a lot about, one, the importance of the New Testament as a historical document, right? That these are biographers writing these things, telling this story, right? The gospel story is the story of Jesus. But that there's no one else in the world in that time that has as much written about them as Jesus does. I mean, it's just amazing to think about that, right? I mean, people might have written a lot about themselves, or a lot about their own thoughts. We have a lot of, philosophers and things writing at that time. But this is remarkable history that's going on. And as we look more and more into the Gospels, and we see, how close the copies are, right? The earliest copy of the Gospels that we have is from about the 4th century, the complete copy. We have incomplete copies dating back to the 2nd and 3rd century, right? Whereas the oldest copies that we have that talk about Tiberius are from the 9th century or even the 16th century, right? So the evidence, the textual evidence for Jesus is so much better, right, than the ones for Tiberius. It just completely blows it out of the water. We'll look at a chart of that a little bit later on. One thing that's interesting in the Gospels is the reference to geographical places, right? Again, another chart. I don't know if this is hard to see, but we've got the total number of Greek words, again, in each book. Then we've got the number of towns, the number of regions, the number of bodies of water, other places that are mentioned, and the total of all those places put together, right? So with the book of Matthew, we've got 18,000 words. We've got 90 different places. That is about 4.9 places per 1,000 words. And it's kind of interesting that as you go across, it's about the same for each one of the Gospels, right? I mean, Mark is a little bit higher, right? It's because it's shorter and Jesus moves from place to place very quickly. So you've got a few more place names in there, relatively speaking. But that's kind of remarkable, right? That they're so close. And it's not that they're all copying each other or something like that. John is almost a completely different telling of the events, right? He highlights completely different events in the life of Jesus most of the time, yet he still kind of comes in about the same thing. It's not that they were just inserting the names because they're all just kind of naturally fitting into the story. It's just that places were so much more important in that thing. So we have very similar high frequency of place names, right? And there's a very wide range, right? Towns, regions, bodies of water, all of this. And so that shows a very intimate personal knowledge of that place, right? Like if I wanted to write a story about Cebu, I could do that, right? And if it's about this neighborhood and about places that I've been, I'm going to be able to give you names of streets, the barangay that's there, whatever it is, right? And I can, branch out slowly from Cebu City, but as I get further away from where I am, I know less and less about what's going on, right? And so if I start writing something about what happens in Leyte or Samar, you're going to realize that I've never been there, right? Because I'm not describing it nearly as well, right? If I want to write something about from back home, where I grew up, I'm going to be able to do that, right? But if you try to write a story about it, it's not going to work because you weren't there. You didn't. You don't know all the places, right? You're not familiar with it. It's going to be obvious this person doesn't know what they're talking about. And so it's important to compare the Gospels that we have, the canonical Gospels, to some other Gospels that were written later on, right? That we know came about in the 2nd and 3rd century. Things like the Gospel of Thomas, right? You may have heard that one in popular culture in the news or something. It might pop up. I think it's mentioned in something like the Da Vinci Code. It's this other gospel of Jesus, right? And people want to talk about it and speculate. But if you look, the entire Gospel of Thomas only mentions one place, Judea, and it only mentions it once, right? Isn't that kind of weird for a gospel, for a story about Jesus' life? That is only going to tell us one place, and it's just the region, That would just be like saying, writing a story about the Philippines or about the Visayas, and that's the only place name that you mention, right? That's weird, right? Why? That's not a very good biography, right? That doesn't show an intimate knowledge of the place, right? That's literally the name of the people of the Jews, right? If you knew one place, that's the only place you would know, right? Then the Gospel of Judas is another one. Guess what? It doesn't mention any places at all, right? So when did it happen? Where did it happen? I don't know, right? We don't know these things. Same thing if you look at kind of the account of the Quran, right? That talks about Jesus. It doesn't know many places either, right? It might know about Bethlehem, but I can't recall. But there's not really a lot of knowledge there as well. Then we have the Gospel of Philip that does mention Jerusalem, and it mentions it 4 times, right? But again, Jerusalem is, it's one of the most famous cities in the world, right? So if you're going to know, if you know the capital of the country, well, congratulations, right? That's like writing a story about Beijing or about London or something. You don't have to know much about the place to know that, it's a famous city. And then it mentions Nazareth and Jordan, which again are pretty famous names, right? He's Jesus of Nazareth, right? So you might know that one. And then the Jordan River. So those are pretty big features or big places that anybody would know from anywhere, right? But none of the small places, like Jacob's Well in the village of Sychar, right? Or Chorazin and Bethsaida, like these little villages around Galilee, right? This is the kind of detail that we get in the Gospels, right? Or the what's the place? Bethany, just outside of Jerusalem. Another one is the fact that Matthew, Mark, and John all refer to the Sea of Galilee, right, as a sea. For them, it's a big body of water, right? It's wow, this is the sea, right? But for Luke, he doesn't call it a sea. For him, the sea is the Mediterranean. That's the big sea, right? The Sea of Galilee is a tiny little thing. He calls it a lake, right? And Luke would know that because he grew up and lived on the Mediterranean, right? Paul met him in Troas. He traveled with Paul all over. He was out there, spent 14 days lost in a storm on the sea, right? You can't do that on the Sea of Galilee, right? Like they have one hard night getting out, but they can still see the shore all the way around them, right? I mean, it's not that big. So there's just these small little details that show that these fishermen that made their livelihood living around the Sea of Galilee, that was the most important body of water to them. That was the sea, right? But for Luke, who's from far away, that's a lake, right? Very, very interesting stuff. Then we can talk about names, right? One of the most interesting things is this looking at the names and going back in archaeology. They've been able to dig up, they found these bone boxes, right? Where people would be buried, and then after a while, once the body had decayed and everything, and they needed more space to bury, they would just take all the bones out and they would put them in a box, and they would put that on a shelf somewhere, and then they would bury someone else there, right? But they would have the names on the boxes. But so we look at things like that. We look at other documents and things at that time, and we find that the most popular names in Palestine at that time, right, were the same really popular names in the Bible, right? So we've got Simon is the most popular name, Jewish name in Palestine in the 1st century, right? And we can know that to the time period, right? Later on or earlier, it might be a different name, right? You go 200 kilometers south or 200 kilometers north, it might be a different name, right? But in that place and in that time, the popular names were Simon, Joseph, Eliezer, Judah, Yohanan, and Joshua, right? And if we look at the New Testament, those are also very popular names, right? Simon, there's 8 of them. There's 6 different Josephs. Now we only have one Eliezer or one Lazarus, right? Well, we got 5 Judahs, 5 Yohanans, that's John, and then 2 Joshuas, right? That's fitting a pattern, right? It doesn't match 100%, right? You're not guaranteed to have a lot of Lazaruses necessarily, but that's what we have. And actually, there's 2 Lazaruses, right? though one of them is a man in a story, right? But he's clearly a different Lazarus, so we could even make that too. But these are the common names. They match, right? And if you look on these are male names. If you look at female names, the most common female name was, you guessed it, Mary, right? And if you look at the Bible, there's, I think, 7 different Marys, right? So just like Simon is the most common name, and there's a whole lot of them, Mary's the most common name, and there's a lot of her. And again, like if you go to a different place, right? There was a Jewish community in Egypt, right? You go down to Alexandria, you go to Egypt in the 1st century. The most common name there was Sabbataius, right? Or Papus, or Ptolemaeus. Now, there might have been some Simons or some Eliezers and Josephs down there too, right? But the most common names in Egypt were names we don't hear of, right? Because they're not names that are in the Bible, right? Because the Bible wasn't written in Egypt. It was written in Palestine, right? So that's how we can see that the names that are in the Bible match the names that were in the place where the Bible was written in the time that the Bible was written, right? So that's how we know that it really was written in that time, in that place, right? Because these things match up. And the thing is, no one knew that until just a few years ago, right? I mean, I think it was just 10 or 20 years ago that someone did the research to put together these lists of all these names and say, hey, look, here's the names, right? You wouldn't have been able to do that 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, when you wouldn't be able to go back and invent the right names for the New Testament area, right? So that shows that these are really documents from that time and from that place. And there's another important thing called disambiguation, right? And I think this just kind of blows my mind a little bit thinking about it. But I mean, it's common sense, right? How do you tell people with the same name apart, right? You probably know, maybe a lot of Johns or a lot of Marias or, Ronalds or something like that, right? We know people that have the same name, right? And how do we tell them apart? Well, first of all, we have nicknames, right? Sometimes somebody might have a nickname that's similar to their name, right? Just a shortcut of their name. My name is Clinton, right? But everyone calls me Clint, right? That's a simple nickname. Other nicknames are completely different from the name, But a nickname is what you get called by most of the people around you, even though that's not your actual name, right? Then there's family relations, right? The son of somebody or the brother of somebody, or and we do this in our conversation. When we explain who this person is, we say, well, that's his wife, or that's my brother, right? I'm just disambiguating. Just the name by itself, it could be anybody, but by giving you this qualifier, you figure out who it is that I'm talking about. I might talk about hometown or region. When I'm doing these things, I might say, oh, the guy from College Station, Texas, or that guy that we met in Cebu, right? Or whatever it is, right? Up in Isabela, or from China, right? That way we know which guy we're talking about, right? Another thing is an occupation or a title, right? If someone's a carpenter, right? Or a tanner in the case of the Bible, right? We have Simon the Tanner, we have Simon the Pharisee, right? These are different ways to disambiguate people. There's religious and political groups, right? Like I said, a Pharisee or a zealot. In modern times, we might talk about someone's political party, or this person's a Catholic, or goes to this church, right? Just it's a place to mark where we know that person from, or how you can tell them apart from someone else. There might be a disease or a condition, right? We have Simon the leper in the Bible. And it's an interesting thing when we look at the names of the 12 apostles, right? This is taken from Can We Trust the Gospels? This is a quote from Matthew chapter 10, verse 2 and 4. The names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. right? Now, here's the thing. Simon is the most popular name in that time. So the number in brackets is the rank in popularity of this name in Palestine at that time, right? So Simon is the most popular. And notice we have a nickname for him. He's also called Peter, right? That disambiguates which Simon of the 8 Simons in the Bible that we're talking about, right? And Andrew, his brother. Now, Andrew is not a very common name for Jews in that time period, right? But it does get a disambiguation. But that's could be a disambiguation, or it could just be connecting him back to Simon, because it's noting the different sets of brothers that are here, right? We've got a couple of brothers mentioned. That also helps differentiate which Simon we're talking about. We got a Simon Peter, whose brother is Andrew, right? Then we've got James, which is a fairly common name, number 11 on the list. And we have a disambiguation. He's the son of Zebedee, right? In fact, we're going to have more than one James and more than one Simon in this very list, right? So we need to know which one we're talking about, right? So James, popular name, disambiguated. John, also popular name, also disambiguated. His brother, right? So also the son of Zebedee, right? Then we get Philip. Philip is not a very common name, right? It's down 61st on the list, right? He's not a brother of anybody on the list, so we don't get a disambiguation. We've got Bartholomew, also not a very common name, no disambiguation. Thomas, not a very common name, right? We just have the name. Matthew, again, 9th on the list, pretty common name, so we need to know which Matthew we're talking about. Well, we're talking about the tax collector, right? Then we have James, popular name, 2 in this list, so this is Alphaeus, the son of Alphaeus. Then we get Thaddeus, not very popular. No need to distinguish between different Thaddeus's. And then Simon again, the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So every time we have a popular name, we have something after it telling us which one of those guys that it is, right? Because you need to know, right? But if it's not a very popular name, there's only one Philip, there's only one Bartholomew, there's only one Thomas. We're not going to get confused when you say Thomas, right? Just like, most of the time people don't get confused when they talk about me, right? Because I'm the only Clint in the group, right? Now sometimes I meet another Clint, and then it gets confusing because people have to sort out who's who, right? Then you have sympathy for people that have a much more common name, because it has to happen all the time, right? But that's the way of it, right? And so this is some evidence that, again, the Gospels came from that time period, were written in that time period by people that lived and really had part in that time. And this is natural, right? It's not a constructed way to do it. It's not some after the fact trying to make it look like it fits. This is just a natural way people talk when they need to tell the difference between different people. And again, we go back to the other Gospels, so-called, and they don't do a very good job with disambiguation, right? When you look at the Gospel of Thomas, we do have a disambiguation for James. We have a James the Just, right? But then we have Jesus, and we have Mary, and Matthew, and Salome, and Simon Peter, and Thomas, right? Now, there's a whole bunch of Marys. We don't know which Mary it is, right? I mean, presumably, maybe from context, you could tell maybe which Mary it is, but we don't have those kinds of things. When you get to the Gospel of Mary, there's one called the Gospel of Mary. We've got an Andrew. We've got a Levi, which was a pretty common name. Again, which Mary, which Peter, and we don't even have Jesus named. He's just called the Savior, right? So the name frequency doesn't quite match up. The disambiguation doesn't match up. When we look at the Gospel of Judas, there's Judas and Jesus, and then a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of names that aren't from that time period and aren't from that place, right? They're Egyptian names. So it's clear that the Gospel of Judas was written in a different part of the world at a different time, right? And we could probably figure out what that part of the world is and what that time is by looking at the names. But that is beyond the scope of this course. Then there's the interesting thing of disambiguation in speech, right? And we'll put up a quote for that. Now, again, this might be kind of hard to read, but this is from Matthew chapter 14, and it's talking about Herod the Tetrarch, right? Again, disambiguation. There's a lot of Herods, right? Which one are we talking about? We're talking about the Tetrarch Herod. He ruled the fourth of this kingdom, right? About Jesus. And he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptizer. He's risen from the dead. That is why these powers are at work in him." For Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John said to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Now notice what we've seen here. When Herod is talking, right, he's talking to his servants. John, remember, is a very popular name, right? So when he's talking to people in the quote, he says, "This is John the Baptizer, John the Immerser," right? He has to disambiguate who he's talking about because he's talking to actual people, and it could be about any John, right? But in the narration of this story, right, because Matthew is writing this for us, right, he accurately quotes Herod, but then when he's just talking, we know what John he's talking about, so he just uses John by itself, right? We're not going to get confused. We're not going to confuse this John with John the Apostle or any other John, right? Because we can read the context of the story, right? So in the quotes, it's always John the Baptizer, right? When the Herodias is, prompts the daughter to ask for the head of John the Baptist, right? She says, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist," right? You have to disambiguate that. What if the girl had said, "Just give me the head of John"? Well, what John, right? You could get a head of any John, right? But she wants the head of John the Baptist, right? So again, in the speech, it's disambiguated, but in the narration, it's not, because it's not necessary, right? And again, that's just a totally natural way for it to flow when you're writing things, when you're telling the story, right? Because you're quoting what the person actually said, whereas in the narration, it's not needed, right? We can see the same thing with Jesus, right? As you're reading through the story, you'll see the narrator is generally just going to say, Jesus did this, Jesus went there, the people said this about Jesus, they asked Jesus a question, right? But when the crowds say something about Jesus, they say, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee," right? Or they say, "Oh, you were with Jesus the Galilean," right? Or, "What shall we do with this Jesus who is called Christ," right? So again, in speech, we have disambiguation because Jesus is a very popular name. There's a lot of them, right? But all of the Gospels follow that same pattern, right, of not needing to disambiguate because we know this is the story of Jesus. We don't need to keep reminding you that it's the Jesus of Nazareth. But when we're accurately quoting people, they have to disambiguate. And so it's very, very nice to look and see that. Then there's some other aspects of the Gospels that show us that they match that time, right? The Jewishness of the Gospels, right? They talk about Jewish customs and they use Jewish expressions, right? Even the Greek is kind of a lot. Sometimes it's Hebrew based. You can tell it was kind of translated from Hebrew or Aramaic because it uses some particles and different things that Greek normally doesn't use by itself. The trees and the plants that are mentioned in that part of the world, right? The sycamore fig tree and the palm trees in Jericho, and the seeds and herbs and things that they had, right? These are the plants. It matches that part of the world in that time period, right? We could talk about money and finance, right? The different kinds of coins that are used. There's so many different kinds of coins and money that are mentioned, right? Specific to that part of the world. Shekels and drachmas and 2 drachma coins and ossuarions. And there's so many talents and minas, right? And so we know that came from that place and that time, right? The rules of finance, right? The the money trading that was going on in the temple, the mention of leaving this with the bankers, or people leaving this there, or the widow's coins, or paying out workers. We're paying out the right day's wage to the people at the right time, right? It all matches up. It's just in every way that we can measure it, it matches up, right? The local languages, right? The Aramaic and Hebrew, the Latin and Greek, all kind of come together. There's different unusual customs that are mentioned, bridal and marriage customs, washing of pots and things that the Jews did. Mark has to explain that to this non-Jewish audience that he's writing to. The practice of Pilate to release a prisoner or something like that. All these different kinds of things, again, give us more and more evidence that this is true and really written in the right time period. And there's so much more that we could get into, right? So in conclusion, the end of our lesson today, all signs really point to the New Testament as a reliable historical witness, right? In all these different ways that we can measure it. The New Testament matches up with or better than the other historical documents of that time, right? If you accept those, why would you not accept the New Testament, right? We'll get into the timing of manuscripts and things in the next few lessons, but it just gets better and better. And it's sometimes we admit more than we think, right? I wanted to say this earlier. I did say this earlier a little bit, but if a person admits that Jesus is a great man of history, then basically what he's saying is that the New Testament is reliable to report that greatness, right? Because it's the only document that tells us of Jesus' greatness, right? So if you think Jesus was a great man, well, then you must think pretty highly of the New Testament. If you think Jesus is a great man, but you don't agree with anything in the New Testament, then I have to wonder why you think Jesus is a great man, right? Where are you getting that idea from? So some people, they don't realize how much they already believe some of the things in the New Testament. And that might be a helpful thing to point out to some people. So the New Testament is reliable history, right? Now, we haven't established that it's the Word of God or something, or that we can trust it for all these other things. We'll look into some more of that as we go along. But we should at least trust it as reliable history to tell us about the events of that time and in the life of Jesus, because we don't have anything to the contrary, right? All these theories and ideas today are just the ideas of men living 1,000 years later trying to say, well, I don't believe that. I think it was this way, but they don't have any evidence to back it up. The New Testament, though, is great history. That is the end of that. Do we have any questions that anybody would like to ask?
Not a question, Quinn.
Okay.
Okay, what's my question? It's regarding the apocryphal gospels, though, or the New Testament Apocrypha. Can
Okay.
this also be a reliable source of the historical events, so like with Jesus? Because we know these are also noble writings by early Christians. They also give accounts about Jesus, his teachings, the nature of God. So can these things or writings can also be a source of the accuracy of the Bible or reliability?
That's a good question, right? And so I think, like I said, if we compare those later ones to the actual Gospels, right, the canonical Gospels, they don't meet the same standard, right? They don't appear to have been written at the right time and at the right place, right? We don't have manuscripts of them that are as old. We have people talking about them. They don't have the same kind of teachings. They're clearly from a later time, like the end of the 2nd century into the 3rd century, and they're preaching a different kind of message, and so it really doesn't match up, right? When we can't fit it into the time period of the 1st century, right? Some people want to say, oh, it's Judas. No, it's not about Judas, right? It's not. This is something written 100 years after the fact, right? Just like people used to believe that about some of the Gospels. These are much later. But as we analyze the history, the Gospels have just gotten closer and closer and closer to what we really know, and these other ones have just gotten further and further away. So I think that answers your question. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you, ladies, for joining us tonight. And guys that are there, hiding behind your cameras and off to the side. So we'll have another class on Monday. But next week we'll just have class on Monday. We won't have the Thursday class because we got some other things. We'll just alternate on the Thursday because we have some other things I have to do. Thank you very much. Have a good night.